How are you guys doing? Dude, ice cream right before the talk. The endorphins are going to be flowing. You're going to be attent, right? You're going to be at attention. So, fellow cypherpunks, free thinkers, ice cream eaters, beautiful people, so happy to be here in Amsterdam. This is absolutely amazing. So, we have an interesting talk today. We're going to talk about death, right? We're going to talk about my death. We're going to talk about your death. We're going to talk about our collective death. Who death by ice cream? That's right. Who here is familiar with the work of Cody Wilson? Anybody by show of hands? Okay, so like a fourth of the room maybe. So Cody Wilson is the founder of a company in Texas called Defense Distributed, and Cody recently wrote an article in a magazine called Agorism in the 21st Century, and in this magazine, his article is called Death Athletic. And one of the things that he said in this particular article is that as human beings, we have a tendency to pursue a hedonic principle. We have a tendency to seek out pleasure above pain. And he specifically said that the ancients, as well as modern philosophers, including Friedrich Nietzsche, said that men have an interest in pain. They have an interest in carrying burdens. And I think that's what a lot of us are doing in this particular space. We have an interest in carrying a burden, taking risks, and risking ultimately our livelihood. So I'm referring to this speech as the Lunarpunk Ethos, and relational governance. And the modus operandi behind this talk is to figure out how we can push our vision forward. How can we engage with the greater community while building privacy-preserving technologies for greater social change, for paradigmatic shift, for change in the world at large, right? Because it's not just about the technology. The technology is important, and it's one methodology, but there are a number of other things that we have to consider. So that's really what I'm here for, to discuss this vision of where we're ultimately going and why it's so important. So there's going to be two main things I'm going to talk about and we're going to focus on today, and that I hope we can engage in a discourse about. The first one is the idea of the Lunarpunk ethos. Who are we? Why are we here? And where are we going? The second part of this talk is going to really look at this idea I've been mulling over for some time called relational governance. The idea of being able to work together with each other in an empathetic and compassionate way for the purposes of altering society, altering our communities on a fundamental level. And we'll get into that at some length. Now you're probably wondering, well, who the hell are you to talk to us about these ideas, right? Who am I? So like you, I am a fellow traveler, a fellow journeyer that is also carrying a burden. Probably about 15 years ago now, I almost went to prison for 40 years. And I'd love to talk about the reasons for that, but there's no time now. Please see me after this. But that experience, that interaction with the United States criminal justice system, that experience of having my liberty trampled really woke me up to the depredations and the vagaries of the current system and the status quo that we live in, and how broken and abhorrent the whole thing has a tendency to become. So I started studying philosophy. I read books like Murray Rothbard's book, For a New Liberty. I started engaging in forums with different people online, and as a result of that, I came into contact with the cypherpunks, right? So my initial gut reaction to these problems was there's got to be an epistemological way to solve these problems, right? An inquiry into knowledge where we can educate people into freedom. We can help people wake up from what Charles Tart called consensus trance. And that would be the direction that I would try to go, until I learned that there is a technological element to this too. We can build encrypted technologies that help protect us and that allow us to preserve, this is very important, human liberties and civil rights. The guy with Panther talked about that a lot. And at Logos, this is a discussion we have all the time. What we're doing is ultimately for the preservation of those liberties and to promote and to build a new kind of society, right? So let's jump into the first part of this, and I want to probably need to explain the idea of Lunarpunk. Who's here familiar with the Lunarpunk ethos and idea generally? Okay, fourth of the room. So the idea behind Lunarpunk is that we're attempting to develop privacy-preserving technologies for the defense of civil liberties. But the thing with Lunarpunk that is important is I think we have an inherent skepticism toward just putting technologies out there in the public transparently in the hope that they're just going to grow, because we expect to have these systems entered into an adversarial environment where people will try to stop us, they'll try to thwart us, they'll try to cut us off at the pass, and sometimes they'll try to hurt us. Again, back to carrying this burden, we're constantly risking death, either metaphorical or literally. Now, one of the things that I really love about the Lunarpunk ethos is I think that we don't have to exist in a left-right paradigm. We don't have to think binary. We don't have to have a dichotomous form of thinking. Instead, we can try to reconcile ideas. We can engage in what Edward O. Wilson, a famous scientist, a biologist, called consilience, or the consilience of knowledge. And so I like to, although I come from a more right-leaning spectrum, I like to analyze all different kinds of ideas. So there's this notion of prefigurative politics that the left anarchists have popularized, and it's the idea that if we're building tools and technologies, encrypted technologies, various blockchains that try to preserve our anonymity, then we're actually prefiguring the way that society should be, you see? Prefiguring the way that society should be. So we're injecting our values, our ideology, our mindset into the system at large for it to become adopted and embraced completely and thoroughly in an unobstructed fashion. And that, to me, is an absolutely beautiful thing. I would go in so far to say that it's not just prefigurative politics, it's prefigurative apolitics, right? Because we're creating an abundance of different ecosystems with people who have different value sets than our own. And I really think that's a key takeaway here. We need to figure out ways to be able to work together, even if we're divided or we think we're divided upon political lines. So absolutely important for doing the great work of what we need to do. Now, I'm going to refer back to our friends at DarkFi. I think Amir Taki's actually here speaking at this event. And one of his compatriots, Rachel, what's her name? Help me out, Rachel. Rose, that's right. Rachel Rose O'Leary. Rachel Rose. So she has this idea that's metaphorical, referred to as the forest, right? This idea that we're trying to develop a forest or a dark forest that acts as a canopy of protection that insulates us from the state apparatus, from bad actors, or from anyone who tries to harm us, right? So the forest just means using encryption, right? Encrypted technologies to ensure that we remain protected and that we can build the tools that we want to build. Something that I've mentioned to some of you guys in person, we've already had discussions. The reason that we do this, one of the main reasons, is if we have transparent technologies like Bitcoin, right? The fact that it's transparent actually psychologically and fundamentally changes our behavior. We're not doing what we actually want to do because there is effectively a chilling effect that prevents us and stalls us and thwarts us from doing what we want to do to actually try to change the world. So this is why we have to have this forest that she talked about so eloquently. Now, I want to elaborate on the forest idea a bit more and what that means infrastructurally, but I think really right now it's story time. I like story time. Do you guys like story time? Yeah. Okay, so who's here familiar with the tragedy of Aaron Schwarz? Cool. So I would expect at least half the room. So you guys who don't know about Aaron Schwarz, he was a hacktivist. He wrote an amazing piece called the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto, and he was a huge fan of getting information out to as many people as possible. In his mind, information was a public good and is a public good, and it should be easily accessible to everyone. At MIT, he actually got onto he hacked into the JSTOR servers, and JSTOR, by the way, is just an academic firewall or an academic paywall with a bunch of papers and citations, research articles, and he just mass downloaded all of this information with the alleged idea of handing it out to everyone because he believed in this open accessibility. By the way, Schwarz was also, he was the co-founder of Reddit, right, while he was alive. We'll get to that, the tragedy here in a minute. Co-founder of Reddit. He was also involved in developing RSS. What ended up happening was he got arrested, and then because they were easily able to find him, he had no insulation, he had no forest, he had no protectionism. And as a result of that, the pressure was too much for him. He was dealing with the possibility of going to prison for 30 years, and he ended up committing suicide, right, at his home, I think after 2 years of going through the legal process. It's important to note that MIT actually exonerated him. They didn't go after civil charges. So that to me was, that speaks a lot right there. They were willing to say, okay, he did this, he had ideological reasons, fine, but the state pursued him aggressively, as they tend to do to hacktivists and anyone who's attempting to protect civil liberties and protect human rights, which I believe is what Aaron was trying to do. So the point, I think, is twofold. One, back to this idea of carrying a burden and risking death. In a very literal way, Aaron died for what he believed in. He was involved deeply in death athletics, right? Death acrobatics. And that's what we're all doing. We all take these risks every single day, that we try to push these ideas forward, that we try to build new tools and technologies, right? The second part is just as important. It's this idea that we need to help each other out. We need to work together. We need to develop that insulation and try to protect each other as much as possible. That could be anything from having the tools and technologies that properly anonymize us, or it could simply mean giving each other emotional resources, being able to connect on a deep level with one another and to have that accessibility. I know that a lot of us want to stay completely anonymized, and that's great, especially from the public eye, but in our communities, we should try to get to know each other as much as possible, and I thoroughly believe that. So let's talk about how that's going to work. That moves into the next segment of this talk, and this is an idea that I've written about in my book, Dignity and Decency. The idea is called relational anarchism. In this case, we can refer to it as relational governance. So what we're trying to do, the ultimate vision of this, yes, privacy, encryption, the technology, great, but that's one part. That's part and parcel of the ultimate goal that we have. And the ultimate goal, I think, is to be able to create autonomous political formations, to create networks of societies where there's people working together for the purpose of continuing to maintain civil liberties and human rights. And my idea of how we succeed at doing this is to work on being able to learn to relate to one another, to overcome schisms and differences, and try to understand each other for who we are, try to stand in other people's shoes, right? One of the people that I'm really fond of who talked about similar ideas a lot is Marshall Rosenberg and his idea of nonviolent communication. If we're able to nonviolently communicate with each other, to connect with each other, and to understand each other's needs, then not only are we able to firm up and steel ourselves against assaults, but we're also able to help each other out. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And the next factor is that this actually demonstrates that we can have communities where we all have different views, visions, be it economic left, be it economic right, and we're coming together to actually change the world and to get people to see that we can be different. We can have different perspectives. We can be cosmopolitan. By our nature, we are heterogeneous. We're all different. And that's the purpose of what we're doing, I believe, on a fundamental level, creating new political formations, creating new sovereign territories where we get along, we get together, and we build the technologies, and we continue to protect human rights. And I think that's an absolutely amazing thing. I do want to mention that there is one fear or one concern that I have, and it's this very Gibsonian idea. And when I say Gibson, you guys are familiar with William Gibson, the famous cyberpunk writer? So he had this idea that maybe the future is obsolete, that the future is non-being, it's non-existent. And I think it was in his 8th book, Pattern Recognition, he said something to the effect that the future doesn't exist because the present is too volatile, and all we have is a perpetual state of risk management. And it's the spinning of various scenarios in the given moment over and over and over again without a direction toward the future. So I think that if we can come together and solve for the social engineering problem that we have, as well as the technological engineering, we'll be able to develop these communities and these enclaves that speak more to our differentiation as a human species. And I can think of no greater goal than that. And I want to speak to the fact that, yes, I'm with Logos, and Logos is an organization where we have a lot of these philosophical discussions internally, because to us it's more about the technology. It's also about the movement. It's about the storytelling. It's about the communication. It's about getting people involved in what matters the most. The tech plus the ideas plus the love and the enthusiasm for everything we're building. And I personally think the future is bright. I think we keep building, keep connecting, keep developing in order to spur and catalyze this ultimate change. So thank you all very much.
Yeah, question at the back. Oh, we've got a few.
So since you start with this, when you will gonna die?
So, man, I'm so glad you answered that question. We're kind of in a situation, right? Because I'm talking about just, the Greeks had that idea of euthanasia, which originally meant the art of the beautiful death. But ironically, I'm also in Blueprint with Brian Johnson. So there's this longevity thing that I'm looking at as well. So I hope I don't die anytime soon, but I am going to try to pursue the beautiful death when it does happen. But I certainly have died metaphorically many times. I've been censored online, of course. Almost went to prison, so I was on probation for a number of years, and so I've experienced a multitude of deaths, just like Cody Wilson talked about experiencing deaths, being censored, etc. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. Cool talk. Thank you. I have just one comment to your talk, that I think there's one other thing worth mentioning around the burden, or like how we approach our lives, is mortido and libido, like the will to live and the will to die. And if I think no matter how big of a burden we all carry individually or collectively, if we do it with libido and having fun and kind of enjoying, then it's not the same as if we would all want to go down the drain together. So kind of that's important, to have fun together. And the question is, could you pitch Logos in 2 minutes for me? I don't know what Logos does. I'm really curious, and I really want to know. Can you do this?
So this is exactly why I don't shill, because now people ask the relevant and salient questions, right? So Logos is one part of an organization that has many different components to it. Logos can be seen as an organization that helps do the communications and maintain an infrastructure stack, right? So there's 3 organizations that we have that are involved in developing hardcore infrastructure for the creation of these autonomous political formations I talked about. So some of the guys are here, you've probably heard of. The most popular one is Waku. Waku is peer-to-peer communication, privatized and anonymous by its nature, right? And I think the Railgun guys here, and they're using Waku as well. The other is that I'm personally really fond of and excited about is Codex, and Codex is durable, decentralized data storage, right? Because there's a lot of threat vectors in terms of data storage right now, with Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, and DApp front ends have a whole bunch of vulnerabilities around this piece. So Codex is that part, and they just released their testnet, right? So they're moving along. And the other one is also exciting. It's Nomos. It's the consensus layer, which is going to be a more privacy-preserving form of blockchain specifically geared around the development of network states, right? So we can create these autonomous formations and have the rule sets and the procedures built into the protocol. Yeah, so that's Logos in a nutshell. It's so like for instance, what I do is strictly the communication. So I work with Logos and help communicate these ideas on behalf of the organization.
You mentioned network states very briefly just then. Is there any particular area you think that network states are going to be? Where do you think we're going to see network states being the most successful, kind of the earliest?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's hard to say, but I mentioned in my talk that we have to be able to demonstrate these ideas. And I personally think that it's going to be very hard to unravel these ideas in the context of the nation state first. So I do think that things like special economic zones, third world countries, smart cities, things like seasteads when the libertarian future comes to fruition, right? That's I think those are possibilities. Personally, I would prefer to see it just start unraveling in midst of the nation state because we've built infrastructure that's very hard for them to penetrate. Again, the idea of the forest. So there's a lot of different ways this could happen. And if you guys want to have a longer discussion about this, there's this idea of panarchy or crypto panarchy that I've been talking about a lot that has it. Really, the network state idea has its roots in that idea, although a lot of people don't discuss it. So I'm happy to talk about that more later on, too. What's that? Sorry? Oh, yeah. Happy to. Yeah, we can talk. I mean, the basis of panarchy is just the idea of non-territorial exit. The idea that we can live wherever we want and not relocate physically and be able to choose what kind of governance service that we live under. So this goes back to some things I was talking about. If we're living in an area, my next door neighbor probably does not share my values or very unlikely, right? And probably doesn't with you guys either. So how do we solve for that? One is the panarchy idea, being able to have a governance service in the cloud or some type of directory. But then on a base level, we have to solve for that too. So now it gets into things like polycentric law, common law. How do we solve for human liberties and civil rights for the people living directly next to each other? So there's a couple of layers to it. So you can see how the dimensionality of the discussion is extremely deep. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. That was excellent.